She is an associate at the Harvard Law School Project on Disability, where she researches inclusive liturgies and ritual change. She previously served as rabbinic disability scholar in residence at Matan, where she taught Jewish educators strategies for inclusive teaching. She also leads a long-running hashtag Parsha Chat Torah study group on Twitter, and is the author of the realsocialskills.org blog. Rabbi Regan was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2017 and previously studied at the Drisha Institute for Jewish Education and the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Ruti Regan.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I love this institute, and the thing I love about it most is that people meet and talk who otherwise wouldn't, and especially people meet and talk who otherwise would never meet as equals. Being a disabled person in a disability-related field, I feel like I can get mental whiplash going from a we to a they to a we to a they again, about 6 times in the course of the same sentence from a lot of my colleagues. And the great thing about this conference is that I can say that and there's no retaliation and we can have a conversation. So I love this conference. I love you all, and I'm going to talk about ritual and ritual change and inclusive liturgy in a way that I think that we often get in our own way, and how I think we could go about trying to do ritual better. So is it showing, where's it showing where my slide's showing? Oh, it's not sharing right now. So stop. All right. So I think whichever field we work in, whichever aspect of disability or religion we work in, I think a fundamental reality. Yeah. They are, like, I'm muted on my laptop. Okay, is this better? Okay. So apparently my iPad can pick up sound in this configuration, which I did not think it could do, especially since I'm muted, so apologies. But so building inclusive community is hard, even when people say the right things. I think we come from a lot of places. We talk about we're all created in God's image. We're all created in God's image. And then we do a lot of things that don't necessarily reflect that, sometimes really egregiously so, even from people who say this the loudest. And it can be really spiritually demoralizing thinking about, like, how entrenched is this? Why do we all say this? Why is this so hard? So I think that to think about why that is and what to do about it, we have to zoom out a little and talk about taking the side of justice and why it is that inclusion works as a euphemism for disability to begin with. The reason inclusion makes sense as a concept in this field is that exclusion has been the norm for a really long time. We live in a world that routinely dehumanizes and discriminates against disabled people. It's baked into all of our major social institutions and traditions, including the religious ones. And it's really hard to change that. But I think it gets easier if we face up to where we're at and where we can be at, because it's a lot harder to do something hard if you've convinced yourself that it should be easy. because then it feels like the problem is you not caring enough or you not trying hard enough. And really, it's just we're doing something that's really hard. We're trying to make major change to a deeply entrenched problem. And it's not just a matter of caring, it's a matter of figuring out what's happening, why, and how we fix it. I've found that I've taught about disability and inclusion, or whatever you want to call it, in a number of contexts. And I've found that the most deeply countercultural thing that I teach is also the one that is the most uncontroversial in words alone. And that's that disabled people are fully human. We have perspectives, we have thoughts, we have ideas, we have feelings, we have a whole range of perspectives, worldviews, and experiences. We have perspectives and agency, including about disability, but about other things as well. And I think if you say it that way, everyone will agree, but implicitly that basic reality is absent from a lot of what we do, a lot of what we teach, a lot of what we talk about disability, even to the point that in presentations about disability, I found that even disabled speakers tend to assume a non-disabled audience and assume that it's about explaining disability to the non-disabled. Really, like all of our perspectives in the room are relevant to what's at stake. So disabled people are fully human. We have perspectives. Really embodying that reality is countercultural and it's hard. So here's one way it's hard is that the subject gets changed. We talk about disabled people, people with disabilities. The subject often gets changed to talking about us solely in terms of needs. Like ramps are ramps, disabled people are disabled people. Like, you know, I'm like people, like we're people, the technical stuff is about access. The subject often gets changed to how other people feel about us, to like what other people think the true meaning of disability is, how they feel about caring about us, what insights they think the existence of people like us can teach them about theology, suffering, human vulnerability, perseverance, whatever. It often the subject gets changed to thought experiments about what others would like to do to us, or what others would think would make disability irrelevant. So I've got this image that's a bunch of light bulbs, one blasting off, because often the conversation gets changed to these things that are sort of adjacent to us, but they're not us. And in ritual and in religious participation, we're participating as people and not as thought experiments or as theological object lessons. And when we talk about building, when we talk about a community that embodies like valuing all of its members and embodies like holding disability experience, we can only really be included in part of our community as people. And that's who we are. So how do we do it? So another thing that happens a ton, so we get treated as symbols. And this is hard to fix because symbols are so entrenched. People have really firm emotional reactions to symbols to the point that it can make it hard to take things literally. And I don't have like a complete solution to this. What I can say is I think we need to watch this, how disability gets invoked as a symbol of vulnerability, of suffering, of the need to accept imperfection, of brokenness, a broken world, healing, something sort of universal and vaguely spiritual, and totally disconnected from the embodied reality of living with a disability in the world we live in. And so one thing that I think that it's important to take stock of is that our disabled experiences have literal spiritual significance, not just as symbols, not just as lesson learned, but like, you know, being a person's complicated. And like, you know, religion engages like the whole body and the whole mind. And our whole bodies, our whole minds, and our experiences as people in the world in relationship to other people are part of that. And they're literal, and they're often absent in religious commentary and ritual, even when the words that superficially are about us get said a lot. So I'd say like, I have this image that's somebody erasing, it's the word disability, and it's somebody holding written on a blackboard, somebody erasing this. And I know that people mean this to be affirming, but you can't actually include us by erasing us and only having space for the aspects of our experience that are universal. Like, our experiences that come out of disability are real experiences. They're valuable, they're part of who we are, they're part of the world, and they're part of what we need a response to, because religion is about things that are real. And, you know, we're real, we're here. And we need that to be held in our communities, and our communities need us. And we are so much cooler as like contributing, participating, leading members of our communities than we are as thought experiences, symbols, or abstractions. So to take it literally, and an example I like to think of as this is that one verse that's really popular in a number of contexts, Jewish and Christian, is this verse in Leviticus: you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God, I am Hashem, right? And I see this get used as a metaphor a lot, in part because, and I also hear from a lot of deaf people that they are literally treated in insulting ways by their communities, and that they are, and a lot of blind people, that they are literally endangered by their communities because of lack of attention to safety or outright like intentional harassment. And so I think that, again, I understand the symbolic resonance this has for a lot of people as a metaphor, but what it's talking about literally is important. And, you know, the Bible itself tells us to attend to it, and that attending to it is part of creating sacred community and like revering God appropriately. So not just metaphors, the literal stuff too. So, and all of that is to say that ritual is really important as a form of human activity. It takes different forms in different contexts, both religious and secular. But ritual is a powerful embodiment of our values, and it holds things that words alone cannot. And it shapes relationships, communities, hierarchies, power, and on all kinds of levels, more than we ever understand just in words and abstractions alone. For better or for worse, our ritual helps to shape who we are, both as individuals and as a community. I have a picture here of a girl reading Torah, which is intended to evoke bat mitzvah, which is coming of age ritual for Jewish girls, which for a long time was only done for boys as bar mitzvah. And embodying our values by treating puberty as spiritually significant in ways that require religious authority in framing whether you're a girl or a boy, I think is something that is both important and readily understood by a lot of people who do gender work in any faith tradition. And that's true of disability as well. Like, our ritual needs to hold that disabled experiences, including the experience of growing into puberty and growing into adulthood, whatever that looks like for you, is a real thing, and you're not going to be a kid forever. And we have to show up and be on the side of people in our communities whose adulthood is countercultural because they're not seen as growing by our mainstream society. But if we can get coming of age ritual right in a way that really holds and takes seriously the fact that we see this as a real thing, that can make a lot of things better for a lot of people. So we have a problem with our received ritual, just like every other institution and cultural artifact we have. It's just that some of our received ritual contributes to the exclusion of our people with disabilities. We want to embody our deeply held values about justice and injustice. Sometimes parts of our received ritual practices can partially embody incompatible values. And this is hard to change because we're strongly attached to our received traditions for really good, important, and sacred reasons. And so when we try to change it, I think, again, all of us who have tried this have found that it's much easier said than done. And that those of us who have observed other people trying this have found that it's much easier said than done. And it often doesn't have the effects we want it to have. And it often can entrench things that are the exact opposite of what we're going for. So even though we all say, you know, we're all created in God's image, let's create this sacred community that holds space for we're all created in God's image, then we do things that just don't seem to go in that direction consistently. And so there's a way that it goes wrong that I think happens across contexts that's kind of complicated. So before I get into like the complicated, like technical way that I think this happens, does anyone have questions, points of clarification about any of that so far?
Maybe this is a question that you don't want to cover, but what I feel like so many times people don't even want to get to the point of even attending the inclusive rituals. And a burial, we have always done it this way, so why do we need to change?
Yeah.
And sometimes they try, and I'm speaking from my own context as a Quaker. Sometimes they are like, oh, we can't change because that would change our whole, what it means to be a Quaker. I won't be offended if that question takes you away from that, from your presentation track. But I feel like this comes up so many times as a barrier to even try to do something inclusive.
But yeah, I absolutely agree. Thank you for that. I think I don't want to get too much into that now, but that's the kind of thing that I would love to get into in much more detail in the afternoon. So in the afternoon, what we're going to do is talk more practically about like workshopping specific things people are seeing in their communities. So if you want to come have a conversation then, I would be like more than delighted. I agree with you that just getting people to the point of seeing change is necessary is its own entire complication. And I think that there are reasons that are legitimate because we're attached to our sacred tradition for reasons that matter, and changing it is hard. And I think that it's a very complicated leadership problem, finding the points where you can push that constructively. We're going to talk in more detail about that in the afternoon. And again, if you want to come have that conversation, then I would be very, very delighted. Also, the reason I'm framing it this way in this particular setting with this group is because I think that we're a group of people who are generally on board with the idea that some changes and adaptations are necessary and have probably had a fair amount of experience finding that things labeled as inclusive ritual or inclusion ritual don't necessarily have the impacts that we would like them to have, even when we can get them to be attempted. And I think that so that's for right now, yes, but to be continued, and thank you. So I'm gonna go on to this sort of technical aspect of, I think that things that we were attempting specifically for the sake of making our ritual more inclusive often don't work. There's kind of a simple and overt way they don't work. Sometimes they just kind of fall flat, feel ineffective in a very overt way. Sometimes they fail more covertly in that they generate positive feelings for some members of the community, but have negative consequences in terms of what the rituals actually embody. And then there's a more complicated thing that I'll explain after I go into more detail about the first two. So overt ritual failures are ritual failures that feel ineffective. And here I have a slide of a picture of people looking bored and annoyed, kind of looking towards the front of the room in a bored and annoyed fashion. So this type of ritual failure is when we try something, we introduce something new or modified or innovative, and a critical mass of the community is just not into it at all. Like, they're like, okay, so why are you doing that weird hippie stuff you learned in seminary instead of like real things? Or like, okay, that's cute, but can we like get back to reality? Or just kind of like those scares of like really, you know, and it, you know, that's sort of the simple case of something that we can tell just is not working as intended. It can be infuriating because it creates this feedback loop where people kind of associate talk about disability with ritual changes that they really do not like, that don't work for them. And that's a complicated art problem. And again, if you want to talk about workshopping ways this plays out in your community and ways you might find ways to shape, that's what we're going to talk about. The more practical aspect we'll focus on in an interactive way in the afternoon. But this is like sort of the simple case of attempts at inclusive ritual that do not work because they fall flat and people, they just don't have buy-in or legitimacy from the communities they're done in. So often, one example of this is when problematic liturgical language gets replaced with really simplistic language or overly abstract language that doesn't really mean anything to people. Having people with disabilities do things that are not really all that related to the ritual at hand, that kind of thing, or just like kind of vague hand-waving apologetics. All of those things happen a lot. I think we've all seen it. But so then there's a more subtle thing, or at least it's often subtle from the perspective of spiritual leaders and can be very unsubtle from the perspective of certain disabled members who have a reaction to it. But something that will happen is ritual that results in people feeling moved, but it moves them to the wrong place. Like already included members of the community feel moved or inspired or uplifted by how great and wonderful their community is. But then disabled members of the community get treated as a source of those feelings rather than as equal members of the community. And then even though it can be something that we put a lot of work and effort into, and promoted heavily as inclusion with the best of intentions, then inclusion and equality are inadvertently undermined because people with disabilities get enlisted as ritual objects rather than ritual actors and community members. And this entrenches the problem further because already valued members of the community feel this unwarranted emotional validation of their self-images as virtuous, inclusive, audaciously hospitable, whatever the relevant adjective is. But disabled members at the margins of the community can experience the ritual as humiliating, othering, as making it harder to show up as who we are and have our real experiences being treated as literally and equally significant. You know, so, and one example of this that I think is pretty common is, say, using some ASL signs to spice up prayers in a service that's oriented predominantly for hearing people, but at a service that deaf people are excluded from effectively because there's no actual ASL interpretation or no captions or anything that would be an effective support, or a reading that emphasizes overcoming disability, frames it as a universal uplifting human experience. Like these kinds of things happen a lot in a lot of ways in a lot of communities, and they can feel great to people with power in a community. So like those feelings of being moved and inspired, we should be a little suspicious of and cautious of, and think about, okay, so we feel moved, where are we actually going, and is it the right place? Is that where we want to end up? And then there's a more complicated kind of ritual failure, so it takes the first kind where it's like an overt ritual failure, and then the second kind where it's sort of feeding these feelings, where the inauthenticity itself gets incorporated as a ritual element. So this way it plays out is that disabled people are allowed to participate in a heavily modified version of something the community values. Maybe it's a bar mitzvah, maybe it's leading a prayer, maybe it's different things in different communities, but something that the community values and considers important in the way that it is done typically by non-disabled people. And disabled people are allowed to do it in a way that does not feel real and authentic to a critical mass of the community, and that is not done in a way that's regarded as like successfully doing the ritual. And it doesn't, and that part of it falls flat, and it feels like it has not successfully done that ritual. But then people like it anyway, because tolerating what they perceive as an inauthentic ritual for the sake of being in an inclusive community is the thing that makes them feel validated. Or in other words, like, we feel like the way we be a good inclusive community is to let disabled people pretend that what they're doing is ritual participation. Which is not a good situation to be in if you're like a disabled person who values your community, values sacred things, and wants to do things that are real. And once this gets entrenched as a dynamic, it can be really hard to counter, because things about disabled people that are in fact true end up feeling and being experienced by the community as things that they believe to be untruths, but that they believe that good people are supposed to say anyway. Like, we're all created in God's image. Everyone has a perspective. We're all serving God here. All of us are equally valuable. Everybody can participate. Everybody has something to say that matters. If people feel that those things are not true, but also feel good about saying them, that becomes a whole convoluted mess. And I think that in most communities that talk about inclusion, that's entrenched to some degree. It can be really hard to untrench. Some examples I've seen of this are, say, having somebody press a single message switch with content they had no role in selecting, and then saying, oh, they said a prayer. They led prayer for our community. Well, I can believe fully in that person's capacity to care for their community, while believing also that if they had no say in selecting that message and they just pressed a button somebody else told them to pick for reasons they were not informed about, I don't think we can call that leading a prayer, but I think we can call that this kind of complex ritual that backfires and makes people feel that inclusion is about doing things that are false. Another thing that happens a lot is allowing a disabled person to do something badly and then publicly effusively praising them for being great at it, and then publicly effusively praising their mother for never giving up on them. Sometimes it's their mother, sometimes it's their teacher. I'm saying that because I've seen that exact format at like a zillion disability conferences. Having an inclusion panel where all of the speakers are parents of people with disabilities and or special educators, but none of them are openly disabled. I've seen a lot of panels like this, including some where the panelists cited nothing about us without us. And you're so close to getting it. So close. But so this is like a bucket of ways that I feel like our attempts at inclusive ritual sometimes don't work and sometimes backfire. So that was a lot. So questions or comments thus far?
Hi, this is Sunil Kandramala. And what is the nature of the rituals through historical perspective with people with disabilities? And I have one more question too. And what are the therapeutic functions of ritual?
So let me repeat, because the questions I think I heard. What I think I heard was, what is the spiritual perspective of people with disabilities, and what are the therapeutic functions of ritual? Were those the questions? The historical perspective. I don't think I understand that question because, I mean, disabled people have a lot of different perspectives. But there's certainly a history of various disabled-led movements about disability that I think are very worth being aware of and learning about. And I could definitely generate some reading about that later, but what I'm talking about, and I would very much encourage learning that history. Right now, my objective is less history and more like thinking about the need to attend to the fact that people in our communities who are disabled have perspectives about disability and all other things, and that the way we treat that needs to embody that. But it's a good question. And what is the therapeutic function of ritual? I mean, I think that is a question I'd ask a therapist, because I'm a rabbi and I don't really see what I do as therapy. And I think that it's actually really important for disabled people to be able to have things in our life that don't have therapy goals. Like, I don't have, I'm married. I don't have a personal development plan with natural supports augmented by a partner integrated in a community setting. Nobody has made a person-centered plan about, how often or how well I should be with my spouse. Nobody made a person-centered plan about what the therapeutic goals of my wedding should be, or of services I lead, or and I think that often everything in the lives of disabled people gets turned into therapy. And often people think that to talk about us is to talk about therapy. And this is something I see go wrong in inclusive education a lot, where educators forget that they're educators, think their role is teaching, and think that once there's a question of disability involved, that means that really figuring out how to teach people belongs to therapists or is about treatment. Really, it's about teaching in educational contexts. It's about teaching in communal contexts. It's about building community. It's about building community, building connectedness, and building ritual that embodies our values. So I think that people who are thinking in a therapeutic context might have different goals than that, but I'm not a therapist, so I think that's a question for a therapist in another context. Okay. Two more, and then I want to move on a little.
Ruti, Rabbi Ruti, this is from Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer, a comment. This idea of feeling moved, but moved to the wrong place, is such a helpful way to frame a kind of ritual failure that's often hard to point out.
Thank you. One more.
This is really helpful, Rabbi Ruti. Because I work as a chaplain, my primary role is as a pastor. That's my training. But in order to serve more people or better support the people in the community, I work directly for an agency, an ARC. And it feels like sometimes we have to speak the language of therapy in order to get any kind of spiritual support at all, to be valued, to have the money to do it. One small congregation can't support all the people. So I guess I just bring that up because sometimes it feels like we're translating or jumping
Yeah.
into a field that's not really ours, so that we can be at the present.
Yeah, that's hard. I know what you mean. I did a hospice chaplaincy internship where I had to put things like the most ridiculous things as cares and goals and documentation to justify my presence there. Like, you know, I just having a therapeutic goal of getting somebody to feel a particular way about death or getting them to accept chaplaincy services just made me really uncomfortable. I think all the more so when you have to do all of the documentation that goes into the disability services setting, or when you're participating in an IEP or whatever other kind of documentation, you have to describe people in ways that really are not okay to describe people. And you have to describe sacred things in ways that are really not okay to describe sacred things. We have to do it anyway because it's a life or death issue. And because otherwise people don't get help. But I think that maintaining some awareness of what we're doing and having communities of support where we can decompress and realize like what we actually believe and embodying things that make sense, which is why like I think really matters. And I think also framing, talking to people we support and in context where it's appropriate, families and caregivers of people we support, about the difference between like documentation language versus reality language. Because we can actually say like, you know, this is how I have to talk about you, how I have to talk about your child, how I have to talk about my colleague in order for the system to cooperate. Here's how I actually see you. And I think that especially people at all points, like I think a core spiritual need disabled people have is understanding the way the system is stacked against us and what that language means, and the kind of hatefulness and the kinds of compromises and the ways with it agency. And I also think that we, like related to that, I think we get a lot of pressure to understand what we do as palliative. Like that our job is to go comfort people, or our job is to go calm people down. And religious comfort can be a beautiful, wonderful, and appropriate thing. But sometimes what people need is not comfort. Sometimes what people need is like validation of the fact that like, yeah, you're right. That is a legitimate thing to be angry about. It's unjust, and your resistance to it is not a spiritual problem. Like, you know, sometimes calming people down, and I think that it's hard because in training, we get trained techniques for calming people down, getting people to have a certain affect, getting people to pray with us, spill their guts, like feel calm. And there's a time and a place for that, but it's also something I think where we're working with or adjacent to the systems, we really got to watch ourselves, and we really need to have a community of practice and watching ourselves and making sure that we're serving what we intend serving and who we intend serving. So thank you for that. And again, this is something that I would love to get into more detail in the afternoon. Okay, I wanna go on. But there's also something that I think is increasingly common, and I see this across other justice axes as well, that there's kind of a masochistic complex ritual failure where people we're feeling bad and guilty and is part of the inauthentic thing that makes people feel validated. Like one way this plays out is a disabled speaker is brought in to say things that are perceived as outrageously unreasonable, but we listen politely and we perform the rituals of decorum with the speaker. And the community feels moved and inspired by their willingness to listen to disabled people by pretending to treat their perceived unreasonable perspective as reasonable. Disabled perspectives are implicitly framed as too impractical to actually engage with substantively, and nothing changes. And I have to say, like, I see this happening in ableist ways. I also see this happening in racist ways a lot, where like people like to do this performative, okay, I listened to somebody. Okay, what did you learn? What are you going to do? And how are you holding people who are actually in your community in a real and complex way? So that's like one Not necessarily the most common way, but it's a way, and I've seen it increasing in popularity. So I'd say like a couple of pitfalls to watch out for, in addition to just the feeling of being moved. Like whenever that hits with regards to disability, like ask yourself, where are we going and is it where we want to go? But also on another level, there's the pitfall of treating disabled people as perspectiveless, and there's the pitfall of ignoring disabled perspective, and they're slightly different but related things. So the cultural norm we're up against is that we forget that disabled people have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives. And again, disabled people do this too, pervasively, even when we're talking to or about people with our same disability. But especially but also when we are not. Forgetting that disabled people have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives on disability that are literal and that are different from the symbolic associations shared by people whose experience with disability is solely metaphorical. Forgetting that disabled people have bodies and embodied experiences, and that we're, our bodies and the way our bodies are in space is part of that. Failing to recognize the full range of spiritual responses that people have, including reference, including irreverence, including blasphemy, all kinds of relationships with ritual, religion and ritual, and so on, because people are messy, and any ritual that says everyone in the room is only feeling one way, and one way is like missing something. So we can recognize a spiritual truth and recognize that people have different feelings about things. There's also diagnostic overshadowing, forgetting that people have their own perspectives that are theirs and are not just like what you learned about how autistic people see the world in some presentation about autism. There's like, we're all people, and people are complicated. Just like no one wants to be friends with that guy who's always on about females and what females want and what females think. A lot of people sound real similar when they talk about disabled people, even when they're trying to be affirming. So just gotta watch that. We're people, not one blob person. And give an example. Here's Liz Weintraub, who's a policy advocate who has an intellectual disability. In her testimony, I've spent the majority of my adult life fighting to be treated like an adult, to be taken seriously when I express my wishes, and only in the last 15 years or so has that started to happen. People with intellectual disabilities have opinions and preferences, and they should be recognized. In our self-advocacy community, there's a saying that we hold very dear to our hearts, and that is nothing about us without us. That means if there is a decision of any kind about us, we expect part of the conversation, even to lead the conversation. And there's Harriet McBryde Johnson, who's a leader in the muscular dystrophy community and in advocacy against the telethon, really like a foundational figure in objecting to a certain kind of objectification. Throughout my life, the non-disabled world has told me my pleasures must be only mental, never physical. Thinking to help me, it is said that my body is unimportant. I respectfully disagree. For me, the body, imperfect, impermanent, falling apart, is all there is. Through this body that needs the help of hands and machines to move, that is wired to sense and perceive, comes all pleasure, all life. My brain is only one among many body parts, all of which work with one another and cooperate as best as they can. So then there's the issue of ignoring disabled perspective within the ritual itself, which is a spiritual consequence of the broader cultural norm of treating us as perspectiveless. Just like forgetting that disabled people are part of the ritual, which can play out in a failure to plan our space, or in saying we and they in ways that are inappropriate to how we actually feel as a community. Like, if we're saying they about people with disabilities and we about our community, we're saying something about our community that's not great. Pitching the ritual solely to non-disabled community members and forgetting to include disabled members in the attempted inclusion ritual. Because if we're pitching our inclusive ritual solely at changing the way non-disabled people feel about disability, we're failing from the beginning to actually practice what we preach, because we're not treating disabled community members as a constituency. So whatever we do, if we want to be inclusive, disabled community members have to be part of the constituency we're planning for and holding spiritually. So I'd say a related stumbling block that I think happens a lot, especially when it comes to adapting ritual for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, is that adaptive ritual often gets oversimplified to the point of stripping away the things that actually make it substantively meaningful. It's particularly pervasive when it comes to attempts to adapt ritual for people with IDD, just because it's harder for our communities to see people with intellectual disabilities as having substantive spiritual capacities. Recognizing that people with Down syndrome can be angry and have spiritually legitimate anger is often a very heavy lift, because often the historical advocacy for the presence of people with Down syndrome in the community is, oh, they're so happy and sunny. And that makes it real hard to make space for the full range of things that people feel, including, you know, anger, disappointment, like jealousy, like any number of feelings that people have. And the thing about ritual overt simplification is you can't adapt a ritual by removing it. And I think that we have to think when we're adapting things, like, is this adaptation giving people access to the substantive ritual that they have the right to as a member of this community and faith tradition? It's really hard to do, but it's important to have that as the goal, because if we remove the ritual, that's not access. You know, and a way that oversimplification often happens is that people want to distill a ritual down to an essence, and then have people with disabilities do something that symbolizes that essence. Like, okay, this ritual is about thank you, this ritual is about sorry, this ritual is about help, or some other thing like that. But no ritual actually only does one thing. No ritual actually only has one feeling. So we have to have ritual, like our modifications have to give people meaningful access and support in accessing the substantive ritual, because access to ritual matters because the ritual itself matters. Real ritual is messy, real people are messy, and we can only include real people. And letting people with disabilities be complex, letting us be in community in ways that are not just about making us easier to manage or calmer, is a really big ask. It's really countercultural. And it's something that the more we embody it in our ritual, the more we can treat it as normative, like the more we can create facts that help people to defend their humanity in the broader world that often tries to deny it to them. So we've got a problem, but we've also got a lot of power to be part of the solution. And I want to talk about this more in the afternoon. This gets back to a question I was asked earlier about communities just don't want to change because they're very attached to the way we're doing things. And I think that sometimes we have to force changes anyway, or at least you can't give the whole community a heckler's veto, but you also have to do things that have a chance of gaining legitimacy in the community as a whole, or the ritual will backfire. So thinking about the way the ritual works, its importance, the moving parts, what people are attached to and why and how, can really help us to find things that we can do in our communities that will actually push us in the direction we want to be going in. So we have to take the ritual itself seriously, because if it didn't matter, then there would be no point in trying to adapt it to begin with. In order to do inclusive ritual well, we have to value and work with underlying ritual in the community. And our ritual can be part of the problem. It can also be one of our greatest strengths in solving that. And I think that we come up against a perceived authenticity problem whenever we want to change things differently. So if you want to keep things the way they are, it's easy to feel like you are authentic and you are defending authenticity against the encroachers who want to like just, buy into modernity and concede everything to secularism or whatever. If you want to change something, it's important to have a spiritual practice of holding on to your sense of authenticity and understanding why it can be hard to feel authentic and help with that. So one thing that I think is the way we get in our own way trying to make change in religious community for the sake of justice, so it often fall into this pitfall of trying to balance authenticity on the one side, justice on the other side. What I'd say about that is we think God doesn't care about justice. Do we think justice is religiously inauthentic? Like, so long as we're trying to balance those two things, ends up putting us in the position of undermining both. And so in order to actually make progress on solving the problem, we have to hold our deeply held justice values about what we believe about disabled people's humanity and role in our communities. We have to hold that as part of our religious authenticity, even when it's part of religious authenticity that we have not yet found the right expression for. And like, we have the right, we have the responsibility, like, to find a problem. We're not doing a balancing act, we're finding expression for the values that we know to be what we should be embodying. And it's hard, but it's easier if we remember why it's hard and keep trying. So it also helps just think about having the courage of your convictions in this sense of a world that you'll often face people who will try to tell you you're being inauthentic if you care about things that are controversial. So no matter what you do, people are gonna call you assimilated, inauthentic, not traditional, just trying to make people feel good, whatever other version of that is. The particular language varies a lot, but I think we're trying to make change for the sake of embodying these values. We all face that kind. So it can be hard to avoid internalizing this, especially when we're trying to make a change and it's not going well, which happens often because change is really hard. It helps to like watch how you're feeling and watch that you're having things that affirm your sense of values and that you're connected to people who can support you when you're not feeling good about this, when you're not feeling authentic, when it feels hopeless and you're having trouble framing it as the expressions of the values you're trying to express. Thinking about it in terms of our communities and our people, like, we have to care more about serving our communities and the disabled members of our communities in particular than we do about the heckler's veto of people who like to call us inauthentic for caring about justice. And it's hard. Also helps to remember that, like, it's hard. It's not hard because of you. It's hard because it's hard. And we fail when we try. We make ourselves vulnerable to failing. There's a lot of trial and error involved. And the error is part of it. And it feels awful, but like, don't internalize it as a sign of values. Just know that this is normal. This is what making change is like sometimes. And it's hard for everybody, and don't be alone in it. Ritual innovation, and we'll talk about this more in the more practical workshopping aspect in the afternoon, but it's art. Art is hard, and we can never get art right from the beginning, just from first principles. We need a lot of trial and error, but we also need to appreciate it as art and as a skilled thing we get better at by developing skills, knowledge, expertise, and collaboration. You can't solve a ritual problem with a mission statement. We've got to make art. We've got to make spiritual art that works for our communities. And like, it helps when we treat quality and support. And okay, and there's a lot of this. I'm going to put it on the Google Drive because there's a lot of specifics about things that I think it helps to think through that I don't want to just put my slides at you. So I want to just skip some of that. But So ableist ritual mistakes of the type I've described, and some that I haven't, and some that I'm sure I'm not aware of, they're really easy to make. They're really hard to avoid. No matter how good you are, rituals are complicated. They don't always do what you expect. We're countering something as deeply entrenched as ableism is really hard, and like just treat it as normal rather than as a threat to your identity, and you'll have a much you'll make yourself less crazy, and you'll also have a higher success rate if you just like can accept that it's hard and celebrate treat the successes and the things that work as real as the things that do not. And I think an elephant in the room in all of these conversations, this kind of work will break your heart. Because the more you see disabled people as fully human, the more you will notice how basic humanization really is. And sometimes that means things that you absolutely loved about your tradition feel different to you and feel problematic in a way that's really hard to assimilate. Or colleagues who you regarded as mentors who really helped you, you might realize that they say and believe some dehumanizing things about people with disabilities. And that's really hard. It's disorienting. It's hard to remember why it's worth it. It's hard to remember what you value. So making space to honor the grief and the heartbreak that comes with really valuing people makes it a lot more bearable and a lot more possible to keep doing the work, keep building, and keep building sacred community, but don't be alone. Connect with other people, share your values, even partially, and find things that sustain you and allow you to hold the heartbreak without being totally broken by it. But the good news about being in a situation where there's such a pervasive problem, such a pervasive and huge problem with humanization and ritual, and none of us can fix everything because the problem's so much bigger than we are. But the good news is that means that we all have things we can fix. If it's everywhere, then there's something we can do. And we can all find things that we can make at least somewhat better. And even in the need, when there's pervasive lament, when there's pervasive problems that just feel and are so much bigger than we are, the things we can get right and the things we can get better really matter a lot too. And hold on to your sense of that and have people you're connected with who help you hold on to your sense of that. And it makes it a lot more possible because the work, so we all got to do it badly, and then we do it badly and then we do it better. And we can trust in the resiliency of sacred things. And this connects with the authenticity thing, that every generation has had to try new things. We've always had to adapt. Adaptation has always involved trial and error. We're the recipients of the things that stuck. So it can make us feel like other generations didn't have this trial and error because we only see the things that stuck. But everybody's had this problem of needing to adapt, not knowing in advance what's going to work. Failed experiments are part of it. And just like have faith in the sacred things that trying something that turns out to work is not going to break it, because the sacred things are also bigger than we are. And we can find and build new ways to serve them, new ways to fully embody them. But we're not going to break the sacred things. And we can act out of love for your community, for yourself, and for sacred things. And we can make a lot of things better. We can have a lot of successes, even in a world that makes it so difficult, and even when things are so much bigger than we are, because the love's bigger than us too. And so at this point, I want to go ahead to some questions. I think there's some in the chat, so I'm going to look there first.
Test.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to take a couple questions and head to lunch a little late. Here's one from the online chat from Molly Lee. Is it helpful to share the purpose of rituals in order to help people understand the purpose of the modifications?
Okay. I think it can be, yes. And again, this is something we can talk more about in workshop, but I think that talking about what we're doing and why can often be very helpful. I think it's often good to say a purpose of this ritual is rather than the purpose of this ritual is. Because like rituals often do multiple things, and the things that different people in the community think of as prominent or most important can differ. But if we say like a purpose of this is, or a central purpose is, I think that that can help with both holding the whole community appropriately and getting more buy-in. I think we also need to make sure that what we're saying is true, because often the things that we're accustomed to saying about ritual can vary from ways that they actually work. So if we're going to introduce a major change in the name of something we say about the purpose of the ritual, I think it's worth thinking first, like, is that true? How do I know? And is this something that my community will see as legitimate if I frame it this way? Or is that going to take more work for framing? Do I need more elements? But yes, I do think that talking explicitly about this is a or a central purpose of this ritual, or this ritual is about even some things, can be very helpful in talking about what we're changing and why we think it's important to change. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Rabbi Ruti. There are two things that come to mind as listening to you today, and I appreciate that you value the intersectionality of our groups and our traditions. But one of the things that really speaks out from what you said is what I call the growing end of human dignity, in the sense that when we realize what individuals with disabilities are capable of with appropriate education and et cetera, that it's really incumbent, if we truly respect human dignity, to raise expectations, as you point out, to not have people stuck in spaces with low expectations, and to accept, abilities that we know could actually develop. And it's important for us to respect that. And it reminds me, not that we do this well, by the way, but in the US Bishop's Pastoral Statement on Persons with Disabilities in 1978, it is still prophetic because we struggle to live it. But there is a line in there that says, if we really live out as faith community, and to your point, it's what I think is really important is to not have therapy. Everything's not about therapy. Relationships are natural, and relationships we all benefit from. So this line in the statement says that individuals with disabilities will need less professional services as a result of being a part of a faith community that, contributes to flourishing of everyone within the community through natural relationships, not programs. And what's really interesting to me in my work, I use social role valorization for a practical framework. That line comes from Bishop in Syracuse, New York, Bishop Costello, who was very good friends with Wolf Wolfensberger. So that's just kind of a side note, but I just want to thank you for that, because I think it's important that we keep trying to therapize everything therapeutic, and as opposed to natural.
And I think I would also say, I kind of take issue some with social role valorization, because I think my humanity comes from God and not Wolf Wolfensberger. I think that there are things that social role valorization has gotten really right, and I think that there are also things that it's entrenched in the service community and special service provision community and special education culture that have been really problematic for disabled people, because no amount of supports, natural or otherwise, can really erase the fact that I am disabled. I have the body I have, and the mind that I have. And sometimes what needs to change is not me. Sometimes what needs to change is like how normative social roles are constructed. And I think that social role valorization has an issue of seeing disabled people as sort of problem by definition and of being in need of being re-socialized into people to be included. And I think this is a longer conversation, so I don't want to get into a whole argument about social role valorization. Okay, possibly, but anyway, I think we disagree about this. It's a longer conversation. But the other thing I will say is I get real nervous about faith community as an alternative to professional support. Yeah, I've made that talking, but I also get real nervous about people being dependent on faith community to exercise basic rights and control over their life. Because I think that people's thoughts about religion might be different in their families. They might change over time. And I don't want people to lose their housing if they lose their faith. I don't want people to lose I don't want people's support and ability to live their lives to depend on practicing a certain faith in a certain way. So I think that while there is, I believe in our religious communities, I believe that our religious communities need to do better by our disabled members, but I also really want to exercise a lot of caution about replacing professional secular support systems with faith-based ones, because I think there's a lot of danger there. So, you know, I want to move on, but I just want to record that's how I see that. Okay, so do we have time for one more?
I think that this is the point that we will stop this wonderful conversation. And thank you, Rabbi Ruti, for just offering wonderful insights and wisdom as always, and invite all of you. There are many good workshop sessions this afternoon, but Ruti will be continuing her conversation around this if you have additional questions.